In the heart of an unassuming Ohio neighborhood nestled among rows of identical homes, a grim secret was brewing. Behind the pristine facade of one such house lived Charles and Matthew Edmonson, a couple who, to their neighbors, seemed perfectly ordinary. They waved hello, kept their yard tidy, and carried an air of unremarkable normalcy. But inside those walls, a nightmare was unfolding, one that would shock even the most hardened investigators. This wasn't the story of a happy family. Far from it. This was the story of a house turned into a prison, a home filled not with laughter and love, but with fear, despair, and unimaginable suffering. For years, Charles and Matthew carried on their charade, fooling everyone around them. They were seen as generous, even noble, for opening their home to 5 adopted boys. But the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. When the story finally came to light, it left a nation horrified. This wasn't a case of ordinary cruelty, it was something far more sinister. These weren't just victims, they were prisoners in their own home, subjected to conditions described as worse than what some prisoners of war endure. The boys were starved, isolated, and abused in ways that defy comprehension. To those who lived nearby, the Edmondsons seemed like any other couple. They shopped at local stores, attended community events, and smiled politely when asked about their growing family. But, as their neighbors would later admit, something about them always felt off. The windows of their home were often shrouded in heavy curtains, and the children were rarely seen. When asked about the boys, the answers were always vague. "They're homeschooled," Charles would say with a tight smile. "They're shy," Matthew would add, and people believed them, because who would suspect the horrors lurking inside? This was no ordinary home. It was a fortress of misery, carefully concealed from the outside world. What unfolded there over the years was a masterclass in deception and cruelty. And yet, despite their meticulous efforts to hide the truth, cracks were beginning to show. A muffled cry here, a fleeting glimpse of a terrified face there. The signs were there all along, but no one dared to question them. Not until it was too late. When the authorities finally entered that house, what they found sent shockwaves through the community. The Edmondsons had crafted a living hell for their 5 adopted sons, hidden in plain sight. And the question that lingers, haunting everyone who hears this story, is simple. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? The answers, like the crimes themselves, are as chilling as they are heartbreaking. The 5 boys who lived under Charles and Matthew Edmondson's roof were meant to have a new start, a chance at a better life. They had come from difficult circumstances, each carrying the invisible scars of abandonment and neglect. Adoption was supposed to be their salvation, the Edmondsons their saviors. But instead of safety, they found themselves in a world that could only be described as a waking nightmare. These boys, all of them under the age of 16, were stripped of their dignity the moment they entered the Edmondsons' home. What awaited them wasn't the nurturing environment they had been promised, but a meticulously crafted system of control and torment. Each boy was isolated, their individuality crushed under the weight of the couple's oppressive rules. They were denied basic necessities, food, warmth, love, and subjected to punishments so severe they bordered on medieval. Starvation was not a punishment, but a routine. Their small bodies, already frail, were weakened further as days stretched into weeks of malnourishment. The basement of the house became their prison, a dungeon in every sense of the word. Dark, cold, and devoid of any comfort, it was their only world. The walls seemed to absorb their cries for help, their voices silenced before they could reach the outside world. In this abyss, they were forced to sleep on the bare concrete floor, sometimes shackled to ensure they couldn't escape. The lack of light disoriented them, their days and nights blending into an endless cycle of despair. Punishments were brutal and arbitrary. A misplaced word, a glance in the wrong direction, or even the simple act of crying could provoke Charles or Matthew's wrath. Beatings became a regular occurrence, leaving the boys bruised, bloodied, and broken. They were forbidden to speak unless spoken to, their silence ensuring the couple's dominance. It was control for the sake of control, a sadistic exercise in power that served no purpose beyond feeding the twisted desires of their tormentors. The outside world remained oblivious. The Edmondsons had constructed an impenetrable facade. Neighbors would occasionally hear the faint sound of crying, but it was always explained away with practiced ease. "Kids can be difficult," Matthew would laugh. "They're just acting out." And for years, no one questioned it. Even the boys' rare appearances in public were carefully orchestrated. They were instructed to smile, to nod, to lie if anyone asked questions. Fear of retaliation kept them compliant. It wasn't until a concerned neighbor noticed something truly alarming that the veil began to lift. She had seen one of the boys outside, his body alarmingly thin, his eyes sunken and lifeless. It wasn't just his appearance that troubled her, it was the way he moved, as if he were afraid of being seen. That image haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The authorities were called, but even then, it took time to piece together the full scope of what was happening inside the Edmondson home. Social workers and law enforcement officers initially found nothing out of place. The couple was charming, their home tidy, their demeanor cooperative. It was only when a social worker insisted on speaking to the boys alone that the cracks began to show. One of the boys, trembling and unable to meet her gaze, whispered a single word: "Help." That word opened the floodgates. As the investigation deepened, the horrifying truth emerged. The basement was discovered, a space that resembled more of a dungeon than a living area. Evidence of their cruelty was everywhere. Chains bolted to the walls, filthy bedding, discarded scraps of food. The boys, now under the care of protective services, began to share their stories, each one more harrowing than the last. They described the beatings, the starvation, the endless cycle of fear. Their testimonies painted a picture of unimaginable suffering, one that left even seasoned investigators shaken. Charles and Matthew Edmondson were arrested, their carefully constructed world of lies collapsing around them. As they were led away in handcuffs, the community struggled to reconcile the friendly couple they thought they knew with the monsters they had turned out to be. The boys, at last, were free from their tormentors, but the road to healing would be long and fraught with challenges. The case became a media sensation almost overnight. Reporters descended on the small Ohio town, cameras capturing every angle of the house that had concealed so much pain. Headlines screamed of the House of Horrors and the Dungeon Parents, drawing national attention to the case. Interviews with neighbors, child welfare experts, and law enforcement officials dominated the news cycle. How had such unspeakable abuse gone unnoticed for so long? What could be done to prevent it from happening again? In the days following the arrests, Charles and Matthew maintained their innocence, their polished charm now turned toward the courtroom. They claimed they had been misunderstood, that the boys were troubled and difficult to manage. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. Photographs of the basement, medical reports documenting the boys' injuries, and their gut-wrenching testimonies painted a damning picture. The Edmondsons' defense crumbled under the weight of the truth, and they eventually pleaded guilty, their arrogance finally giving way to the inevitability of justice. For the 5 boys, liberation was bittersweet. They had escaped their torment, but the scars both physical and emotional, would remain. The community rallied around them, offering support and resources to aid in their recovery. Yet the question lingered: how had these horrors been allowed to persist for so long? And how many more children might be suffering in silence, hidden behind closed doors, just like them? The 5 boys who were taken into the Edmonson home each arrived with hopes of finding the safety and stability that life had denied them. They had experienced hardships before, but nothing could have prepared them for the nightmare that awaited. Charles and Matthew Edmonson were not the loving, compassionate caregivers the boys had been promised. From the moment they entered the home, the atmosphere was oppressive, filled with rules, threats, and an eerie silence that seemed to hang over everything. At first, the boys were treated with superficial kindness, but it didn't last. Gradually, the couple began to assert their dominance, using fear as their primary tool. Meals became less frequent, conversations were forbidden, and the boys were punished for the smallest infractions. Soon, even basic human necessities were withheld. The once normal interactions the boys had expected turned into calculated cruelty. They were stripped of their individuality, their humanity eroded day by day. The basement of the house was where the worst of the abuse occurred. It wasn't just a basement, it was a prison, designed to isolate and torment. The air was damp, the light minimal, and the space devoid of anything that could bring comfort. Thin mattresses or even piles of old rags served as their beds. Food was rationed to the point of starvation, and often the boys were left to go hungry as a form of punishment. They were locked away for hours, sometimes days, with no escape from the darkness and cold. The physical abuse was relentless. Beatings were routine, and any attempt to resist or protest was met with even harsher punishment. Charles and Matthew seemed to take pleasure in their cruelty, their power over the boys a source of twisted satisfaction. They justified their actions with claims that the boys were unruly, that they needed discipline. But the truth was far simpler. They were sadists who delighted in the suffering they inflicted. The boys were not only victims of physical abuse, but also psychological torment. The Edmonsons manipulated them into believing they were worthless, that no one would care if they disappeared. Isolation was a key part of their strategy. The boys were rarely allowed outside, and when they were coached on what to say and how to act. Any deviation from the script risked severe repercussions. They were taught to hide their fear, to suppress their pain, and to smile in public as if everything were normal. Their lives became a performance, and every misstep brought more suffering. For years, the Edmonsons maintained their charade. They fooled neighbors, acquaintances, and even professionals who briefly interacted with the family. The boys' silence, born out of fear, played into the couple's hands. But over time, cracks began to form. A neighbor occasionally heard strange noises, muffled cries or thuds late at night. Others noticed the boys' gaunt appearances during rare sightings. Still, no one acted immediately, their suspicions not strong enough to overcome the Edmonsons' carefully constructed facade. The truth only began to surface when one of the boys found a fleeting moment of courage. Malnourished and visibly terrified, he whispered a plea for help to a social worker who had been called to the home. That single act of bravery set off a chain reaction. Authorities arrived to investigate, initially greeted by the Edmonsons' usual charm and insistence that their family life was perfectly normal. But the deeper the investigators looked, the harder it became for the couple to maintain their lies. The breakthrough came when police obtained access to the basement. What they found was worse than they had imagined. The space was dark, filthy, and filled with evidence of the horrors the boys had endured. Chains and restraints were discovered, along with scraps of food that had been thrown on the floor as if the boys were animals. The smell of neglect hung in the air, a testament to the years of abuse that had taken place. The boys themselves were in dire condition. Malnourished, covered in bruises, and deeply traumatized, they barely spoke when officers approached. It was as if they had forgotten how to communicate, their voices silenced by years of fear. Medical examinations revealed the full extent of their suffering: broken bones that had been left untreated, scars from repeated beatings, and signs of long-term nutritional deficiencies. The boys were taken into protective custody, and their journey toward healing began. Charles and Matthew Edmonson were arrested, their calm demeanor betraying none of the terror they had inflicted. They attempted to downplay the allegations, insisting that they had done their best to care for troubled children. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. Neighbors who had ignored their suspicions now came forward, expressing regret for not speaking up sooner. The community, once blind to the horrors in its midst, was now grappling with the truth. The arrests marked the end of the Edmondsons' reign of terror, but for the boys, the trauma would not fade so easily. Years of abuse had left deep scars, both physical and emotional. Therapists and social workers began the difficult process of helping them rebuild their lives. The House of Horrors was now empty, but its shadows lingered, a grim reminder of the darkness that had once thrived there. The Edmondsons faced a media storm, their story making headlines across the country. Reporters descended on the small Ohio town, cameras capturing images of the couple being led away in handcuffs. The community's shock turned to anger as more details of the abuse emerged. Questions about how the system had failed these boys dominated the news cycle. How had the Edmondsons been able to adopt multiple children without raising red flags? How many opportunities to intervene had been missed? The couple's trial became a focal point for the nation's outrage. In court, the boys' testimonies were heard, their voices trembling as they recounted the horrors they had endured. Their words painted a vivid picture of the Edmondsons' cruelty, leaving no doubt about their guilt. The defense's attempts to shift blame fell flat, and the couple eventually pleaded guilty, sparing the boys the ordeal of a full trial. As they were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, the Edmondsons showed little remorse. Their calm facade remained, as if they still believed they could manipulate the system. But this time, justice had caught up with them. For the boys, it was a bittersweet victory. They were free, but the scars of their ordeal would remain. Their story, though filled with pain, became a rallying cry for change, a reminder that vigilance and compassion are needed to protect the most vulnerable among us. The story of Charles and Matthew Edmondson's horrific crimes quickly became a media frenzy. Reporters from across the country descended upon the quiet Ohio town, their cameras capturing the now infamous house that had concealed so much suffering. Images of the seemingly ordinary home contrasted with the chilling details of what had transpired within its walls, dominated headlines. News anchors described it as a house of horrors, while pundits speculated about how such heinous acts could have gone undetected for so long. The story captivated and horrified the public in equal measure. Neighbors, once silent, were now eager to share their thoughts with reporters. Some described hearing faint cries or strange noises over the years, but admitted they hadn't thought much of it. Others revealed their unease about the Edmondsons' reclusive behavior, with some questioning why the boys were rarely seen in public. There were those who expressed guilt, saying they had suspected something was wrong but had not acted on their instincts. "I should have called someone," one neighbor tearfully told a reporter. I didn't want to believe it." The media coverage didn't stop at the crimes themselves. It delved deep into the systemic failures that allowed the abuse to continue for so long. Investigative journalists uncovered lapses in the adoption process, with critics pointing out that the couple's application should have raised red flags. How had they managed to adopt 5 children without sufficient follow-up from social services? How had so many warning signs been overlooked? These questions became the subject of national debate, with child welfare advocates calling for immediate reforms. As public outrage grew, the Edmondson's case moved swiftly through the legal system. The couple initially maintained their innocence, hiring a high-profile defense attorney to argue their case. In court, they presented themselves as misunderstood caregivers overwhelmed by the challenges of raising 5 adopted boys. They claimed the children were troubled and that their disciplinary methods, while strict, were necessary. Their attempts to portray themselves as victims fell flat. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and the prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture of their actions. During the court proceedings, the boys' testimonies were heard, their voices shaking as they recounted years of torment. Each word they spoke was like a dagger, piercing through the Edmondsons' lies. They described being locked in the basement for days on end, denied food, and beaten for the slightest perceived disobedience. One boy tearfully recounted being chained to a wall while the others were forced to watch. Another described the crushing isolation, the feeling of being utterly forgotten by the world. Their bravery in recounting these horrors left the courtroom in stunned silence. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including photographs of the basement, medical reports detailing the boys' injuries, and testimony from social workers and law enforcement officers. Each piece of evidence painted a vivid and horrifying picture of the couple's sadistic cruelty. The defense's arguments crumbled under the weight of the facts, and public sympathy for the Edmondsons, if it ever existed, evaporated entirely. Under mounting pressure, Charles and Matthew eventually changed their pleas to guilty, avoiding a lengthy trial that would have only deepened their infamy. Their decision to plead guilty was seen as an attempt to minimize their sentences, but it was too late to salvage any semblance of their reputations. The judge, clearly moved by the gravity of the case, delivered a scathing rebuke during sentencing. Addressing the couple directly, the judge described their actions as inhuman, emphasizing the lasting damage they had caused their victims. Charles Edmondson received a minimum sentence of 15 years, while Matthew was sentenced to at least 13 years. These sentences, though significant, were seen by some as insufficient given the severity of the crimes. Advocates for the boys argued that no amount of prison time could truly atone for the years of suffering the children had endured. For the victims, the sentencing was a bittersweet moment, a step toward justice, but not an end to their pain. The aftermath of the trial brought a mix of relief and unresolved anger to the community. The boys, now under the care of protective services, began their long journey toward recovery. Each of them faced unique challenges, from physical healing to the psychological scars left by years of abuse. Therapists and counselors worked tirelessly to help them process their trauma. But the road ahead was undeniably difficult. Some of the boys struggled to trust adults, their experiences with the Edmondsons having shattered their sense of security. The case also prompted a nationwide reckoning within the child welfare system. Investigations were launched into how the couple had been able to adopt multiple children without raising suspicion. Social services agencies across the country faced scrutiny, with lawmakers calling for stricter oversight and more thorough background checks for prospective adoptive parents. Advocates pushed for mandatory follow-ups after adoptions to ensure children's safety, arguing that the Edmondsons' victims might have been rescued earlier if such measures had been in place. Despite the reforms sparked by the case, the Edmondsons themselves showed little remorse. In brief statements during sentencing, they expressed regret for the misunderstandings that had occurred, but stopped short of taking full responsibility. Their lack of accountability only deepened public outrage, solidifying their reputation as monsters who hid behind a veneer of respectability. In the years to come, their names would become synonymous with betrayal and cruelty, a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. For the community, the scars of the case lingered long after the Edmondsons were sent to prison. The once quiet neighborhood was now a symbol of unspeakable horror, its residents haunted by the knowledge that such evil had been so close. Neighbors who had ignored the warning signs struggled with guilt, while others became more vigilant, determined to ensure that no child would suffer in silence again. The house itself, once a nondescript home, stood as a chilling monument to the horrors it had concealed, a place many hoped would one day be demolished, its dark history erased. As the Edmondsons began their prison sentences, the story of their horrifying crimes continued to reverberate across the country. The 5 boys they had tortured were now safe, but their road to recovery would be long and uncertain. For them, freedom was bittersweet. The chains had been removed, the abuse had stopped, but the trauma they carried was far from over. Each child faced a monumental task: to rebuild a life that had been torn apart, to find trust in a world that had failed them so profoundly. Therapists described the boys as resilient yet deeply scarred. Some spoke of their difficulty in forming connections, their mistrust of adults, and their fear of being hurt again. Others struggled with anger, at the Edmondsons, at the system, and at themselves for believing the lies they were told. Slowly, piece by piece, they began to heal. But the question loomed: could they ever truly move past what had been done to them? The Edmondson case also left a mark on the community. It sparked debates about responsibility and the failures of those who might have intervened earlier. Neighbors asked themselves difficult questions. Why had they ignored the signs? Why hadn't they acted when they saw the boys looking malnourished or heard the faint sounds of crying late at night? Could someone have saved those children sooner if they had been more vigilant, more willing to get involved? This story became more than just a horrific crime. It became a call to action. Social media lit up with debates and discussions, with people asking themselves and each other, what would you have done? If you heard something suspicious, would you step in or would you look the other way? How far should someone go to protect a child who isn't theirs? These aren't easy questions, and the answers often revealed as much about people's fears as their intentions. Some argued that it's human nature to avoid conflict, to tell ourselves that things aren't as bad as they seem. You don't want to believe your neighbors are capable of something so evil, one commentator wrote. Others disagreed, insisting that in a world where child abuse is rampant, it's better to overreact than to let something slip by. I'd rather make a false report than live with the guilt of knowing I could have saved a child, another said. What do you think? If you were one of the Edmondsons' neighbors, would you have noticed the signs? Would you have acted? Or do you think it's unfair to place blame on people who couldn't have known the full extent of the horrors happening behind closed doors? These are questions worth asking, because cases like this aren't as rare as we might want to believe. Beyond the community, the case ignited a nationwide discussion about the adoption system and the gaps that allowed the Edmondsons to take in 5 boys despite their clear unsuitability as parents. Many questioned how they had passed background checks or why social workers hadn't conducted more thorough follow-ups after the adoptions were finalized. The system, it seemed, was failing the very children it was meant to protect. Reforms were proposed, including stricter oversight of adoptive families and mandatory check-ins for a certain period after adoption. But not everyone agreed on the solutions. Some worried that increasing regulations could discourage well-meaning families from adopting, further straining an already overburdened system. Others argued that no amount of regulation could completely eliminate the risk of abuse. You can't legislate away evil, one advocate said, but you can make it harder for people like the Edmondsons to slip through the cracks. What do you think? Should there be stricter rules for adoptive parents, or do you think the system is already too complicated? How do we strike a balance between protecting children and encouraging adoption? These are tough questions, but they're questions we need to answer if we want to prevent another tragedy like this. For the Edmondsons, life behind bars became their new reality. They were no longer in control, no longer able to manipulate and abuse. But even in prison, their actions continued to cast a long shadow. Fellow inmates reportedly viewed them with contempt, a common reaction to those convicted of crimes against children. Some speculated that their time in prison would be anything but easy. But does it matter? Does their punishment bring any real closure to the boys they harmed or the community they betrayed? Justice, in this case, feels like a word too small to encompass the damage done. The boys lost their childhoods, their sense of safety, and their trust in the world. Can a 15-year sentence for Charles and a 13-year sentence for Matthew ever truly balance the scales? Or is the justice system inherently limited in its ability to right such profound wrongs? What's your opinion? Do you think their sentences were fair, or do you believe they deserved harsher punishments? Should crimes against children carry mandatory life sentences? Or is there a point where punishment becomes less about justice and more about revenge? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they're worth considering. The Edmondson case will remain a dark chapter in the history of child welfare. It's a story of unimaginable cruelty, but also of resilience and hope. The boys, though deeply wounded, have a chance to rebuild their lives, to find happiness despite their past. The community has a chance to learn from its mistakes, to be more vigilant and compassionate in the future. And we, as a society, have a chance to confront the uncomfortable truths this case has exposed. So now, we turn the question to you. What should we take away from this story? What can we do to ensure that no child endures what those boys went through? How do we balance vigilance with empathy and justice with mercy? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation, because the only way to prevent darkness like this is to shine a light on it.